Okay. Good evening, everyone. Shalom. Welcome. We are here today at Eidos. It's March 26th, and we are beginning our series on the Haggadah. And tonight we're going to look at some maybe unexpected themes that we find in the Haggadah. Much of what I'm saying was inspired by this really great Haggadah called the Lovell Haggadah, with translation and commentary by Matthew Berkowitz. Every year, Gabi gets me a new Haggadah for Pesach, and it would be strange if he got me a new Haggadah for Shavuos. She gets me a new Haggadah for Pesach, and a few years ago, this was it, and it remains one of my favorites. So for those of you in TV land, you can see what it looks like, and I highly recommend it. So we're going to we're not going to start at the beginning because I want to make there's some favorites that I want to get to, and so I thought that we would start on page 4 with the theme of turning outward on on Pesach. Oh, and I'm sorry I can't share the sources on Zoom. I'm only have my phone, so
That's
I
okay.
can't do that. Hopefully, Yitzhak will bring you the sources, and you'll be able to see them. So, in terms of what I mean, turning outward is that there is a theme which we could find in Pesach, and it actually in the Haggadah, and it actually arises very early in the Haggadah when we say Kol Dichpin. Right at the very beginning of the Seder, right? We have Kadesh or Chatz, Harpas, Yachatz, and then right at the beginning of Magid, Halachmanya, we talk about the bread of affliction, the Achlu Avatana Ba'arad in Mitzrayim, that our ancestors ate in Mitzrayim, and then we have this invitation: Kol Dichpin Yesevi Yechol, Kol Ditrich Yesevi Yifsach. All who are hungry, come and eat. All who are in need, come and join the Pesach. And then Hashta Hacha, L'shana Haba B'Ardi Yisrael, Hashta Avdi L'shana Haba B'nei Chorin. Just parenthetically, has anyone ever noticed that this is a very strange way to begin the Seder? To invite people once we're already around the table, presumably with all our invited guests there.
Presumably, this would have been said before the Shpitas Karban Pesach, because it's had to be checked in Limnuya.
Yes.
So presumably this would have been said previously.
Yes, so it could be sort of zecher le, like to commemorate what was done, because it originally, when we had a Karban Pesach, and the Karban Pesach had to be shechted specifically with those in mind who are going to eat it, and it all had to be very carefully doled out to make sure that everyone had at least a kazayit and there was none left over, right? So maybe there was some sort of public, people met in the town square and sort of said, hey, if you don't have a Karban Pesach partner yet, why don't you come and join? Yeah. Yes, Sivan Rachav Meir, I think is her name. Yeah. Oh, very nice. Okay. I actually just it came to me today as I was discussing this with someone that this could be sort of a little bit of a guilt trip, right? Like if I look around the table and there are no guests, and I say this, I'm thinking to myself, I think next year I should do better, right? Because this is what it's telling me that the whole Seder is about people who are hungry. And there's also interesting the distinction. What is the distinction between kol dichpin and kol ditzrich? All who are hungry and all who are in need. Now, what's the difference? So it could be, this I saw in the Haggadah of Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. It could be that kol dichpin is people who are hungry, and kol ditzrich is people who don't have a Karban Pesach partner. And so this is actually quite beautiful, because it's reminding us that when we reach out to people, we reach out to people for their physical needs and for their spiritual needs. Both of those are important elements of extending ourselves towards others. And he also pointed out quite nicely that there are two sources of doing the right thing. One is a ritual source, right? We have mitzvot, we have obligations that the Torah gives us, which are explicit, and we have to do them. But then there's also the kol dichpin, just like the internal moral compass that we have, which has nothing to do with a mitzvah. Like sometimes we get into the ova mitzvah vacation, I guess is that a term, of life. And unless we can fit something into a box of a specific mitzvah, well, it's not so important. And here it seems to be saying, no, like before God gave us the Torah, right? There was Avraham who had a sense of morality, and the Avot and Imahot, and there's punishments in the Torah for people doing things that were wrong before the Torah was given. And so we have these two sources, if you will, of morality. Okay, so now let's get into this question of turning outward, and the highlight's going to be this beautiful part of an essay from Rabbi Soloveitchik. So if you look on page 5, we have this notion of turning outward. So we start with the Mishnah in Psachim that says, Arvei Psachim samuch lemincha, lo yochal adam ad shetechshach. So on Erev Pesach, close to Mincha, one is not supposed to eat until it gets dark, and that's so that this is actually quite challenging this year with Erev Pesach being on Shabbos. It's a long day. There's nothing to do but eat. But on the other hand, there's nothing to eat. So I'm not sure what we're going to do. But nevertheless, this halacha is teaching us that we're not supposed to eat late in the afternoon on Erev Pesach because we want to make sure that we come to the Seder and eat the matzah l'te'avon. We want to eat the matzah while we're hungry. Their matzah must have been really, really good if they considered the possibility of just looking forward to this delight of matzah. Even the poorest person must not eat on that night until they recline, meaning everyone, even the poorest person, like Pesach is a great equalizer. Even the poorest person takes on at least the outer trappings of freedom, of royalty, of wealth, right? Everyone. V'lo yifchatu lo me'arba kosot shel yayin, and we have to make sure that the poor person has no less than 4 cups of wine, v'afilu min hatamchoi, even from the charity plate. So the Mishnah here it explicitly goes out of its way to tell us that that there's a communal obligation. That's what the tamchoi is, right? It's the communal charity plate. That there's a communal obligation to make sure that everyone, even the poorest of the poor, has arba kosot, has enough wine for the 4 cups of wine. So right away, right off the bat, and by the way, this is found in the 10th parak of Masechet Psachim, the first Mishnah, and the 10th parak of Masechet Psachim is a step-by-step guide of how to carry out a Seder. Meaning, if you find yourself on a desert island on Pesach and you don't have a Haggadah, but you have Mishnah Psachim for some reason, right? You go to the 10th parak, go to the 10th chapter, and if you basically follow the 10th chapter, you'll get the a rudimentary Seder, and you'll be able to fulfill all the mitzvot of the Seder. There is this great podcast, by the way, called Desert Island Torah, I think it's called, and they have different Jewish personalities on, and they ask them, if you knew you were going to be marooned on a desert island, what Torah book, what sefer would you take with you? It's really an interesting question. Think about it yourself, of what different things people say. So maybe it would be Mishnah Psachim, so at least you know how to carry out the Seder. But we see right off the bat, in the very first Mishnah of the 10th parak, which is the declarative statement by Chazal of how to carry out a Pesach Seder, we are told that there's a communal obligation to take care of the needy. And the Shulchan Aruch, then we'll turn to that source on the bottom of that page. Sholin behilchot Pesach kodem lePesach 30 yom We learn the halachot of Pesach for 30 days before Pesach. That's a standard operating procedure before any Chag. At 30 days before, we start learning, at least 30 days before we start learning the halachot. Uminag liknot chitim lechalkan la'aniyim l'tzarach Pesach. And sort of riffing off of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah was talking about making sure that the ani has wine. Here, we make sure now that the ani also has kimcha, has kemach, kimcha de pischa, ma'ud chitim, right, has money or to buy wheat or wheat so that they can make matzah. L'tzorech pesach, v'komi shadar be'ir ben chodesh tzarich litein lazeh. And this is an interesting just side note on how Jewish taxation works. Right? When do you become obligated in the taxes of the Jewish community? Once you've been living there for 12 months. That indicates that you are a resident of that place, and you're obligated to participate in the needs of the city. So we have these two very nice sources. One teaching us about an ani and the obligation to make sure they have wine, and the other, again, a communal obligation. This is a good time for me to.
It doesn't specify it's a support of your community versus some. It says specifically you have to take care of people that are poor. So that could imply
Correct.
that, meaning according to the Shulchan Aruch, that we might. Who cares if the person lives in that? Meaning, it's my obligation in general to take care of someone. What is it?
Well, we have general klalim, general principles in Hilchot Tzedakah, Aniyeh Ircha, Kodmin in general.
I understand, but I'm saying, why does it make a difference? It seems like you have to take care of someone according to the mission.
Because right, the Mishnah, when the Mishnah is talking about wine, because I think the Mishnah, because I think
Because if you live there for a month, you could say, I gave already in the office. I gave in the town where I live. You know what I'm saying?
right. So it's trying to also the tamchoy is a communal obligation. So I think they are similar in that sense, but that's definitely a distinction. I was about to say before you asked your question that this is a good time for everyone to remember that Tomchei Shabbos collects money for Kimcha de Pischa, and that's a wonderful way to fulfill that mitzvah for Erev Pesach. Okay, if we turn the page now, we're going to look at a really interesting essay, part of an essay from Rabbi Soloveitchik. It comes from this book called Festival of Freedom, which, as you see, Essays on Pesach and the Haggadah by Rabbi Soloveitchik. And it's from an essay called The Exalted Evening, the Seder Night. And what Rabbi Soloveitchik does in classic fashion, and it's really very interesting, is he starts off by noting that the highlight, of course, of a Seder night is the highlight of Pesach is the Seder, and the Seder is essentially a seudah. It's a meal. And Rabbi Soloveitchik notes that in halacha, in Judaism, a meal is not just an opportunity to satiate one's hunger. There are halachic elements of a meal. And then he also goes on to distinguish between the way, let's say, a human being eats and the way an animal eats, because he notes that there's nothing particularly human about eating, right? All living organisms eat. They all have to find a way to nourish themselves. But human beings have the ability to elevate the practice of eating, and he talks about 4 ways in which a human being can elevate their eating, and one of them is when we, using the terminology that we're discussing, we use the meal to turn outward. Okay, so by way of introduction, I'll note that what Rabbi Soloveitchik is suggesting is that an element of freedom is the ability to do chesed. It's actually really a beautiful idea, right? That a slave doesn't have the wherewithal usually to do chesed. They don't have their own stuff to share. And as we'll see in Rabbi Soloveitchik's stark illustration of this, sometimes a slave can't think about others, right? They're so worried about their own survival that the option to think about others, it doesn't even occur to them. And this is not a judgment. It's just human nature, because your sort of animal instinct kicks in towards survival. And as Rabbi Soloveitchik noted, like I said, everybody eats. All animals eat. Wild animals eat in a way which is not necessarily illustrative of chesed, of sharing, but a human being can do that. And so it's actually a really interesting exercise to think about and to talk about at your own Seder table. Like, what are the elements of freedom? So I come and go as I please, etc. But one of the elements of freedom is chesed. The last class that we're going to do of this three-part series is curiosity as an element of freedom. We're gonna get to that. So with that background, let's look at a few paragraphs of this essay, and the subtitle here is the Seder as the Chesed community. So he says the meal as the medium through which the individual, breaking out of his encasement, finds the thou and begins to address himself to him, was introduced by God in Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan, prior to the miraculous exodus. So Rabbi Soloveitchik here is making a really bold claim about why, and we'll see it explicitly, why God gave the mitzvah of Karban Pesach. Right? So we may be aware of, well, God told us to slaughter what was ultimately the God of the Egyptians as a way to illustrate to them that we are no longer under their rule and we're not afraid of them, and they're not going to have any power over us. By Soloveitchik, which is sort of a standard answer, Rabbi Soloveitchik has a very different approach, and he's saying that the notion of using a meal as a way to reach beyond ourselves to others was introduced to the world, to the Jewish people, on the very first Pesach night. And he continues on top of page 7. The ceremonial of the Passover meal, centered around the Paschal Lamb, aims at the emergence of the new Chesed community. For Chesed, and here it is the characteristic mark of the free man. The bondsman is not spiritually capable of joining the Chesed community because he is too much concerned with himself, too insecure, too fearful as regards to the morrow, too humiliated to think of someone else, too frightened, and too meek. This is sort of the beautiful language that Rabbi Soloveitchik uses. But something changed, right? The Bnei Israel were slaves, and so they were too afraid, too concerned for themselves, too insecure, too fearful. And then all of a sudden they're free on Pesach in Mitzrayim, on Pesach in Egypt. And God says, what should you do now? You should have the meal with this Karban Pesach. And what do you have to do? You have to share it. You have to share it with others, your family. And if there's going to be too much, you have to knock on your neighbor's door and say, hey, neighbor, join me for Karban Pesach, because we're not allowed to leave any over. It's going to be too much for us to eat. Right? That is something that Bnei Israel, up until that point, couldn't even think of doing. And all of a sudden now, God is telling Bnei Israel, you could now finally think as a free person. And Rabbi Soloveitchik gives this example from the concentration camps. I've read this many, many times, and it's never sat well with me, this next paragraph, because maybe like me, perhaps you also have heard of exactly the opposite of what Rabbi Soloveitchik is going to say. I don't discount what he's saying. Of course, this is he's recalling real conversations, but I've always felt uncomfortable with it. But it makes the point very powerfully. And this is what he says: people who spent time in the concentration camps during the Holocaust tell me that something similar, something dehumanizing, happened to most of them. All emotions were extinguished. No compassion, no sympathy, no chesed. No concern for the thou stirred in their bosom. Every human instinct, every noble emotion was nipped in the bud by grisly fear and horror. When they come back to the gates of the camp after 12 or 15 hours of work, the Nazi doctor used to look at them and classify them as right or left. Right meant to back into the cold barracks on an empty stomach, and left meant straight to the crematorium. There was no time to practice chesed. There was no time to experience the need for chesed. There was no time to be concerned about anyone else. There was only one fright, one horror, one fear. So Rabbi Soloveitchik is using the example of the Shoah, the concentration camp, to make his point about Mitzrayim, right? That there was no chesed in Mitzrayim because, like a concentration camp inmate, right? You basically have one concern: your own survival, and beyond that, it's very, very hard to think about anything else. So, if you've read Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, you have a very different impression of the Holocaust, of the concentration camp experience, because his whole point is if you find meaning, and in the concentration camp, it often was taking care of someone else or thinking about your survival afterwards, you could have the will to survive. But here, Rabbi Soloveitchik is telling a different story, which no doubt is true for, or was true for some. He says most, not all. But his point is, I think, nevertheless, a very powerful one.
That the average person, yes, they're doing hard or vote or whatever. The average Jew is thinking about the next Jew. So,
Rabbi Soloveitchik seems to be suggesting that during the actual shibud, during the actual time of slavery, maybe not. And he's gonna be more explicit now in this next paragraph. The birth of the chesed community of a nation within which people unite, give things away, care for each other, share what they possess, is symbolized by the paschal sacrifice. And here it is. God did not need the paschal lamb. He had no interest in the sacrifice. He simply wanted the people, slaves who had just come out of the house of bondage, to emerge from their isolation and insane self-centeredness into the chesed community, where the little that man has is too much for himself, where whatever he possesses transcends his ability to enjoy. So I think Rabbi Soloveitchik is this is quite a chiddush. This is quite a novel explanation of why there was a Karban Pesach. It was to force Bnei Yisrael to start sharing. It was to force Bnei Yisrael to enter into what Rabbi Soloveitchik calls the Chesed community. Up until then, they weren't in the Chesed community. They were in a selfish mode. Again, not in the judging way. And then finally, God says, no, now here's what it means to be free. It means to be able to share, even if you don't have a lot, but just the mental capacity, the headspace to be able to share. And Rabbi Soloveitchik quotes the psukim, and we could just jump to the last one. If the household is too little for a lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the souls. And I think what he's suggesting is, while they were free to ask them to share their food, would have been an absurd request. What do you mean share? I have to save it. What about tomorrow? And now it's not that tomorrow's a guarantee either, but with the yoke of slavery off of you, you have the capacity to think about others. A new fellowship was formed around the Paschal Lamb. A new community sprang into existence. So not only is Pesach, according to Rabbi Soloveitchik, Zman Cherutenu, right, the season or the time where we celebrate our freedom, it's also the time where where chesed, communal chesed, was introduced to Bnei Israel. Up until then, on the communal level, it did not exist.
Interesting. I committed the offense of reading the 2 paragraphs prior.
Yeah.
And he talks about the zimun, through which Birkat Hamazon assumes a new dimension, but he says that the idea is that we try to translate the ceremonial into a community formed by the act of eating. Well, why don't we have zimun, if you will, the motzi, rather than for Birkat Hamazon. If
Right.
you want to translate the ceremonial into a communal act of eating, we should say Rabotai, not Nivarech, but
Nochal. Right.
or Nivarech Hamotzi. whatever.
Right. Right. That's a great question. What comes to mind is the Zimun is retroactively telling us what was happening at the table.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. So this, I found this to be so, such a fascinating read of what's happening on Pesach. What's happening on Pesach is we're celebrating, because I think Rabbi Soloveitchik is arguing, what good is freedom if it's not shared? Or what good are the bonuses of freedom? And the Rambam says this explicitly, and I think it's in Hilchot Yom Tov, where the Rambam says we're supposed to be besimcha, we're supposed to rejoice on Yom Tov, and that means you have to make sure that the poor people have enough food, and if not, that's not Simchat Yom Tov, it's Simchat Kreso. It's the joy of your belly. Right? So what?
Maybe this is the explanation why you have to invite people, because if there isn't a concept of being united together, meaning everyone technically could take care of themselves, but it's not a definition of doing it together. It's not a definition.
Right. So exactly. I think Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying we talk about unity, we talk about achdus, but what he's saying is put your money where your mouth is. Right? There have to be other people around the table. This could be why it's become so. We invite guests on Shabbat and other Yomim Tovim, but the Seder somehow has developed into like the example par excellence of when we invite other people to a meal. 40 people at my Seder, right? It's like the competition of Shavuos. It's like the competition of how late the Seder went. My Seder went till 1 a.m. My Seder went till Shavuos, right? And we have another competition, which is how many people did you have at your Seder? Right? I had 40 people on my Seder, right? And it could be that this is sort of, without us realizing it, what's behind the notion of having big Seder meals, because it was on Pesach when this notion of a chesed community was introduced, because that is the definition of freedom. The ability to do something for someone else is, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, the very definition of freedom. And then he says this, the halacha coined the term chavura with reference to the group gathering together for this ceremonial. Eating together is what we use chavura now in all types of contexts. But originally, the chavura was the people who were eating the Karban Pesach together. This notion of gathering the chevra, gathering the friends. Eating together is a great medium of communication between individuals, therefore everything is shared. The slave suddenly realized that the little he has saved up for himself, a single lamb, is too much for him. The slave spontaneously does something he would never have believed he was capable of doing, namely, he knocks on the door of his neighbor, whom he had never noticed, inviting him to share the lamb with him and to eat together. No wonder our Seder commences with a declaration, as we started with Halach Manya, this is the bread of poverty. Whatever we possess, even if it is just the bread of the poor, or poor bread, is too much for us, and we invite all to come and share with us. Let all who are hungry come and eat. So that is one of the themes of the Seder I'm suggesting is this notion of reaching out, reaching beyond ourselves, even beyond our families, turning outward. We see it with Ma'ot Chitim. We see it with the Mishnah's requirement that we make sure that the aniyim, that the poor have wine. And then Rabbi Soloveitchik makes the claim that that's the very reason for the mitzvah of Karban Pesach, to force us into a posture of sharing and doing chesed, which is something, as he notes, the slave is not capable of doing. Yeah.
So the word hungry could be spiritual freedom.
Uh,
And others are hungry. Spiritual freedom.
well, it's both. It's both. It's definitely a spiritual freedom, but it's a real hunger. And that's what we have to invite around our table is people who are. It could be people. I would imagine a lot of us don't know many people who are really hungry, but we do know people who are lonely, who are alone. We know people whose family is not here for Pesach or whatever the situation may be. Yes, Josh.
So it has been taken issue with this sort of nature. What you point out too, is an example.
Yeah.
But I think that the difference, thinking that to go out of myself and to share with somebody, and it's a whole different thing to feel that I'm responsible for somebody else. Sharing still doesn't make you responsible. I mean, I can share something because I already have too much to eat. So it's possible that Kabbalah Pesach actually make me much more responsible for Klal Israel or other people as opposed to just sharing. Maybe I need a lot.
Well, I would certainly say that is the thrust of the Mishnah and the Shulchan Aruch, because the Mishnah says there's an obligation to make sure that the poor people have 4 cups of wine, and the Shulchan Aruch said there's a minhag, a custom, a practice to make sure that the poor people have enough flour so they could have enough matzah. So that seems to definitely be language of obligation, of responsibility. And you could also make the argument that Rabbi Soloveitchik calls it the chesed community, but chesed is obligatory, right? It's something with, right? In Judaism, there is the aniyim have a right to be taken care of. We don't have that in like America. We have obligations, but we don't have a lot of, well, people have rights, but we have obligations not to harm people. But no one would say in America that a poor person has a right to be fed. That's unfortunate. In Judaism, we say that. A poor person has a claim on the community. So, yeah, I think that's right.
How much it would be paid to go to somebody else.
Right. They negotiate a better deal. Right. Okay. Any other thoughts on this theme of Pesach?
Whole in between the cases and that whole time frame is all on the focus of Chesed and taking care of others. Because right after comes, the Omer and over. There was just this period. Throughout the year, you don't necessarily see this idea of taking care of others as much as in this time frame.
Right. Right. And again, that makes sense because Salvation suggested that's when it was introduced into our mindset. Okay. I wanted to look at an interesting connection between Pesach and Rosh Hashanah, because many of us are familiar with Rosh Hashanah, right? The beginning of the year, Tishrei, Aleph Tishrei. We're on page 4. But the Mishnah teaches there are 4 Rosh Hashanahs, and that is on page 4. Arba Rashi Shanim Heim. Be'echad b'Nisan Rosh Hashanah leMilachim v'Regalim. The first of Nisan is the new year for kings and festivals. Be'echad be'Elul Rosh Hashanah leMaser be'Ema. Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon Omer be'echad b'Tishrei. So there are different Rosh Hashanahs, and then we know that if we look on the next page, we have this notion that we have a Chodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chadashim, which is talking the pasuk in the Torah that talks about Chodesh Nisan as the first of the months. Right. So from a personal perspective, Rosh Hashanah of Tishrei is very important because that's when, as individuals, we engage in the process of tshuva and introspection and self-improvement. But from the national perspective, Nisan is the more significant month because that is the month where we became Bnei Yisrael. We were the Torah says, right, that God took goy mikerev goy. We were sort of a nation which was sort of sublimated in, or somehow, covered by another nation. And then when God took us out of Mitzrayim, then our nationhood flourished. And so from a national perspective, Nisan is the more important month, right? Um, um, so that's just something to keep in mind. And there are these really interesting similarities between Pesach and Rosh Hashanah. If you look on top of page 5, I've listed them, right? So we have a period of preparation before Rosh Hashanah. Traditionally, Elul, right, is a whole month where if you spend time in yeshiva, you feel this very acutely, that it's the time to really focus on tshuva and self-improvement and cheshbon hanefesh. And as we said before, 30 days before Pesach, we're also supposed to start thinking about Pesach and learning about Pesach and studying the Haggadah and studying the halachot, etc. Another similarity is that of renewal and rebirth, right? Rosh Hashanah is, as I mentioned, it's the birth of the world, it's repentance, it's personal renewal and rebirth. But then Pesach brings spring, nature renews. Today's a great example of what a little spring can do to town. Rosh Hashanah also has notions of repentance, right? Tefillah, tshuva, tefillah, utzedakah, we say, ma'avir and roa hagezerah. And Pesach also has this notion of repentance, as symbolically removing the chametz has been understood and interpreted to be referring to removing the negative things, removing the puffed up, like the chametz aspects, the puffed up aspects of ourselves. And as we mentioned already, Pesach has the notion of tefillah. There's definitely tefillah in the Seder, and there's definitely tzedakah in the Seder. We said at the beginning, kol dichbin, and we also have the Mishnah in Pirkei in Psachim that talks about making sure the poor people have wine, and the Shulchan Aruch talking about ma'od chitim. So there are elements of tzedakah also in Pesach. So when we talk about these two different Rosh Hashanahs, one is the individual Rosh Hashanah of Tishrei, and one is the national Rosh Hashanah of Nisan. There are a lot of similar elements between those two, and Pesach is another opportunity. Then, in that case, for us to be thinking about new beginnings, and all of the ingredients that go into new beginnings. Okay, let's do one more, and let's now go to the beginning, page 1. So I want to talk about the theme of partnership in the Haggadah. So we often think about Pesach as meaning Passover. Right? God passed over the houses of the Jews during Makat Bechorot in Mitzrayim in Egypt, and killed the firstborn in the Egyptian homes. So it's talking about skipping over or springing over. There are other interpretations which I want to look at, which talk about the notion of partnership. So let's look here on page 1. This is the pasuk. Vaya adam lachem laot al habatim asher atem sham. The blood is going to be the sign of where you are. V'ra'iti et hadam, and I, God, will see the blood. Ufasachti alechem, I will pass over you. V'lo yebachem negev, so that no plague lamashchit, to destroy you. Ba'akoti be'eretz Mitzrayim, when I strike the land of Egypt. Let's learn Rashi. Ufasachti v'chamalti. So first of all, this is quite beautiful. Another theme that we're not going to have a chance to get into today, although it's in the sheets a little bit later, is the notion of of compassion. Right? Right? How does Rashi? What's the first interpret? We're all more familiar with Rashi's interpretation that Pesach means to pass over, but Rashi's first interpretation of the word Pesach, is that God will have compassion for us. It's another, also fits in with the notion of spring. It's warmer, it's easier to live, it's a more compassionate climate, right? V'chamalti. And he quotes a pasuk, V'domeh lo pasoach v'himlit. He quotes a pasuk from Yeshayahu about God delivering us, which is an element of compassion. Vani omer, kol psicha lashon dilug ukfitza. And then he says, I say that the root Pesach occurs as an expression for leaping or springing over. Upasachti, and so that pasachti here, midaleg hayam batei Yisrael batei Mitzrayim, that God was jumping or springing over the houses of the Jews when he reached them. Shayu shuruyim zeh betoch zeh. V'chein poschin al shtei hasifim, a pasuk in Melachim, of sort of sitting or hovering over two. V'chein kol hapsichim holchim kikotzim. That's what this word means. V'chein pasoch v'himlit midalgo umimalto miben mumatim. He understands the pasuk in Yeshayahu to be not only the chamalti but also skipping, and by skipping, then God is delivering them from the Egyptians. So that is sort of standard of what we think about when we think about Pesach. But now Rashi adds a few more things. On page 2, Vaya hadam lachem laot. I don't know if you've paid attention to this. And the blood shall be unto you for a sign. Lachem laot v'lo lacherim mikan shelo natnu hadam ela mi bifnim. If you've probably had this image in your head since you were a kid, right? That the Bnei Yisrael had to put blood on the doorpost. Where? Like a mezuzah, which is on the outside. Right? We always connect the mezuzah to the blood, but Rashi says, if you read the pasuk carefully, it says the blood is for you as a sign.
Yeah,
right? Hashem doesn't need it. The Mitzrim didn't matter to the Mitzrim either, and he's suggesting here that the blood was actually inside their house. So now we have to try to understand, like, what's the point of that? Right? Maybe you want it for the Egyptians. The Egyptians will see, oh, every house that has the blood on the doorpost, they're okay. And every house that does not have the blood on the doorpost, we're not okay. Maybe there's something about this God. Right? That would make sense about why to put the blood on the outside. But that's not. It seems to be only for Bnei Yisrael. That's question number 1. And then Rashi says further, V'ra'iti et hadam, God's going to see blood with his X-ray vision, because it's not right on the outside. It's on the inside. Hakol galui lefanav, right? Everything is manifest to God. Ella amara kadosh baruch Hu. So he did not need to look at this blood. So what's the purpose of the blood? Notein ani et einai lirot shatem asukim b'mitzvotai. I am going to see. I'm going to pay attention to take notice of the fact that you are engaged in the mitzvot, meaning, I guess, was the Karban Pesach. And I will then pass over you.
That interpretation doesn't go very well with Lashon Lachman.
Oh, why not?
Because the Pesachti here is really, you're doing it, so therefore I'm jumping over and I'm going.
He says he's jumping over then Ramanut, although the jumping over ultimately resulted in it, right? So you could, they're all interconnected somehow. But so the question is, right, what's the point of the blood on the inside of the doorpost? So it's obviously correct. It's for Bnei Yisrael. And then Rashi adds, I'm going to see that you've done the Karban Pesach. So what do you think is going on here? Yeah,
When across the Red Sea, we weren't supposed to be elated. The angels were not supposed to be elated that the Egyptians died. Um,
right. Maseh Yadai,
when we do
right.
the Seder, when we go through the list of the Makos, we remove a drop of grape juice or excuse me, wine, uh, having some compassion for the Egyptians. uh, And here it would suggest that if the Egyptian firstborn were being slaughtered, and it's not a happy situation, and we see the blood on our doorpost, uh, that is a sign of suggesting compassion.
So the blood on the doorpost is a sign of compassion for the Mitzrim who were at that moment, at least the firstborn Mitzrim, who at that moment were being killed.
Weren't being killed.
Okay, that's an interesting interpretation. Rashi doesn't quite go in that direction. Rashi says it has to do like the blood on the inside is a sign that Bnei Yisrael were osek b'mitzvotai, that they were engaged in the performance of the mitzvot. This is the blood from the Karban Pesach, right?
That was already showing that they were observing the commandment.
Ah, right. Great. Okay, I'm going to get back to that. Yes, Josh.
In the beginning, we talked about how slaughtering the Korban Pesach is like an act of defiance and showing the Egyptians that we are not afraid. But isn't putting the blood on the inside of the house actually feeding that purpose and making it much more vivid?
Well, we had one sign of defiance, and this is something else. You're right. This is not that. You're correct. By putting it inside, it seems to be indicating that this is not about showing the Egyptians. It seems that it's about showing Bnei Yisrael themselves. Like what is that? So in this Haggadah, Matthew Berkowitz suggests that it's to highlight that the salvation of that night was, of course, carried out by God, but there needed to be some active participation on the part of Bnei Yisrael. Right? That the argument he's making is, well, he doesn't quite say this, but what I'm suggesting is not only they have to opt in, it's a dignified salvation. Right? When something is handed to you without any effort, that's nice, but it lacks dignity. Right? If one, that's why many people don't like taking charity, because it feels a little like a loss. Now sometimes it's required, but and that's why there are so many different programs. There's one here in town where they offer meals. You could either pay a nominal fee or you could work in the kitchen for an hour. And if you work in the kitchen for an hour, then you get a meal. Because it's a dignified way to provide something to someone. And so it could be that when Bnei Yisrael are looking at this blood as they're being saved, they're saying, oh yeah, we did something. Like I don't want to understand this as God saying, well, since they did the Karban Pesach, I'm saving them. And if they didn't do the Karban Pesach, I'm not going to save them. I think it's a little more subtle than that. It's that doing the Karban Pesach was Bnei Yisrael's way of opting in and also being a partner. Like it's similar to what happened at the Yam Suf, right? Until someone stepped in.
I think having the blood on the inside where you don't see it also, not celebrating it, except internally, it's a sign that you show respect towards the community.
Right, this right.
Outside, it would have been a little bit
Although they did slaughter the animal in full sight of everyone, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Bnei Israel, at that moment were focused on the feelings of the Egyptians. The Torah tells us, right, right. But I think it's like when Bnei Israel were at the Yam Suf, right? The sea did not split until someone walked in and said, "I'm taking initiative." Right, so it could be similar here, that the key to opening up the salvation of that night was sacrificing the Karban Pesach, and then putting the blood on the inside of the doorpost where only Bnei Israel would see. It was God's way of reminding them, it's mostly me, yes, because you're not in a position so much at this point to save yourself, but it's a little bit of you. And I was just before we started, we were just talking. I was talking to Yitzchak about Yitz Greenberg's new book. His One of the main points of his overall outlook of Jewish history is that as Jewish history progresses, God's diminished, obvious presence in the life of the Jewish people is not to be understood as God abandoning us. It's to be understood as God trusting us, right? That we could do things in a more dignified way on our own. We could establish Medinat Yisrael with, I'm not saying without God's help, but without an open Kriyat Yamsuf type of miracle. Some people would argue that it was an open type of miracle, but it was certainly a military achievement. So I think that could be what's going on here. That when Bnei Israel are starting their national life, they're being taught the importance of being a partner with God, right? And this notion of being a partner with God is threaded through so much of Judaism, most notably all of halacha, all of Jewish life, right? Is man-made. Right? God gave us the Torah and gave us the tools of how to interpret the Torah, and then said, "Okay, you're on your own." Right? We have the famous story of the Tanur Shel Achnai, where there's a debate between the rabbis, and one says A and one says B, and God says B is right, and the rabbis say, "Lo b'shamayim he." You retired from the Torah business at Har Sinai. Now it's up to us. It's nice that you think B, but we think A, and we're going with A. And then God says, "Nitzchuni banai." My children have defeated me. Right. So this notion of dignity and partnership and participation emerges at the very beginnings of the establishment of Am Yisrael, and that's an important theme. Now that this is a hidden theme, because if you read the Haggadah, right, this theme is very obvious in the Megillah, in Megillat Esther, where God's name is absent, and it's all Mordechai Esther, Mordechai Esther, Mordechai Esther, and Charbona Zechor Latov. And the Haggadah is Moshe's name is mentioned once, but only parenthetically, and it's all God. Anivolo Malach, Anivolo Saraf, just me, just me, just me. That's true, and it's important to keep that in mind. But there's also, I think, this hidden element of, and maybe also at this I'll end. Maybe we see this. This brings us back to the beginning of our discussion, the notion of our responsibility for the poor people to have wine, and our responsibility for the poor people to have kamach, and our responsibility to make sure that everyone has Karban Pesach, right? That is, the alternative could say, God will take care of them. I don't need to do it. God will take care of them. Right? So we don't do that. We never do that. And it's so even though the Haggadah is all about God, there are elements in the Haggadah where our partnership in creating the world that God wants is very evident, and could be alluded to here, that the Karban Pesach was important, and the blood of seeing it was not important for God or the Mitzrayim. It was important for us to see it, so that we start off our march with a little dignity. And this could also be an explanation of why we were supposed to take some spoils. right? We are going to go back and say, no, we did all of this. We deserve, back pay, 300 whatever years of back pay, right? Another dignity claiming moment. So those are some of the hidden and not so hidden themes of the Haggadah. Next week we're going to talk about. Let me see if I could remember the specific topic for next week, which is actually quite cool. It is, I think it's creative suffering in the Haggadah, right? A unique, and we're going to study again Rabbi Soloveitchik, but also Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. And then on the 19th, we'll talk about curiosity as an element of freedom. Any comments or questions before we say Laila Tov? Yes.
One of the things I inherited from my ancestors was a way of intoning Kol Dichtim. Very, very distinctive. I don't hear this around here because there are all these new tunes and newfangled ways of singing things and saying things, and the old stuff has been flushed away. But the Kol Dichtim, I remember, even though the people around me don't.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording.